Okay, I'm Holly Barnes-Bennetts. I'm a lecturer at the University of Worcester in the UK and a PhD researcher. My area of interest is sexuality studies and most particularly the practices of positive sexual consent. I believe that we need to understand the full spectrum of consent, not just the negative, violent and traumatic end of the spectrum represented by rape and sexual assault, but also the positive end of the spectrum represented by people exercising respect and compassion in their sexual practices. I believe understanding the full spectrum is our best hope for developing really useful and realistic sex education, which promotes good consent practices. It's important for us to understand the complexities and nuances of positive consent, which are often overshadowed by calls for enthusiastic, clear verbal consent, which make up only part of the range of positive sexual communication. My research is working to use innovative methods and approaches to generate data and theories on good practices of sexual consent in diverse relationships. I hope that ultimately this will lead to useful guidance and materials for relationship and sex education in institutional settings, community settings, and in the public sphere. I'm here today to talk to you about the method and methodology of my research, which uses a novel interactionist approach, which alongside existing consent research will offer depth and complexity of understanding of the topic, whilst also using the tenets of critical sexuality studies to ensure the emancipatory nature of the research and bring criticality and concepts to assumptions. So before charting the journey of the development of the methodological approach of my own research, it's useful to have some overview of the research practices in positive sexual consent that have preceded it. This is a young field. While there were some studies starting to explore positive consent in the 1980s, for example, Byers, the first study clearly addressing the topic, what happened when people expressed and meant a yes in sexual encounters, was published by Hall in 1998. Hall's method of research was to deliver a questionnaire to 422 university students in a classroom setting. The questionnaire asked participants to describe their most recent sexual experience, wherein they indicated yes, how they indicated this, verbally or non-verbally, and if non-verbally, how the non-verbal response was given. The quantitative approach represented by the questionnaire has remained popular in positive consent research. I reviewed over 60 positive consent studies from Hall's in 98 to those most recently published around June 2022, and found that 68% of us made use of a quantitative approach, rising to 77% when mixed methods studies were also included. And this is not unreasonable, given that the field of positive sexual consent research is mostly dominated by researchers from psychology and public health fields. This naturally means that the methodological approaches and assumptions are influenced by more scientific and sometimes positivistic traditions. There are notable exceptions to this, such as Hunt in 2021 and Sethi in 2020, who have employed a wholly qualitative approach. In many cases, participation in the research has taken place in exam-like conditions in booths or classrooms. And more recently, the delivery has moved online, for example, Walsh et al. In 2019. Practices have ranged from asking participants to recall or report on their last sexual experience, or to presenting participants with a scenario or vignette and asking them to imagine themselves in it or to cast judgment upon it. Especially in the early decades of positive consent research, participants were almost exclusively recruited from university student populations in the US and Canada. This limited the demographic in terms of age, race, class, and culture, not to mention level of education. Additionally, many early studies excluded LGBTQ+ participants, although some have been completely focusing solely on members of the queer community, for example, Barres in 2021. There's also been some other key factors identified as relevant to the exploration of sexual consent. Barres and MacDonald and Fangahel focused their research on positive consent contextualized by BDSM practices, where consent is necessarily more explicit to ensure safe practices. Additionally, it's been noted that intoxicants have been an important role to play in consent practices as well, and that's been explored by Ward et al. In 2012 and more recently Hunt et al. In 2021. And it's also important to note specifically the work of Kristen Joskowski, who's been involved in publishing over 30 papers relating to positive consent, traversing qualitative and quantitative methods, university and wider population-based participants, straight-only and LGBT-inclusive studies, and exploring the role of intoxication. This is a very brief overview of my findings. I'm very happy to share more detailed data with anyone who's interested, so you're welcome to get in touch. So each and every one of the pieces of research I reviewed have made an important contribution to our understanding of positive consent, and by extension, the wider consent spectrum. Nonetheless, as someone from a sexuality studies background, I was surprised to find that very few of them employed a methodology which aligned with the approaches of modern critical sexuality studies. This isn't a criticism of the papers themselves. I believe that a multidisciplinary approach is our best hope of understanding this. Rather, it seems like a conspicuous omission from the perspective of critical sexuality studies. This approach seems to have largely failed to closely explore and examine how consent works in spaces of sexual intimacy and how it's perceived and practiced. As this is a multidisciplinary conference, I won't assume that everyone present is familiar with critical sexuality studies or indeed its forerunners. So I'll just offer a brief overview of the journey of sexuality studies and the form that critical sexuality studies takes in order to explain how my research fits with that tradition. Sexology, as it was first known, came into being as a consequence of Enlightenment thinking. The classification of natural and unnatural bodies, events, phenomena, acts and desires, and the practice of studying and codifying through the scientific method. This was a period where sexual desire was considered to represent a bodily threat, not necessarily to those who were desired, as we might imagine today, but to the desirer. Informed by religious doctrine, sexual desire was seen as base and animalistic, and the release of fluids could result in what was believed to be damaging to health. Thus, an excess of desire was considered a medical condition. This medicalized discourse was highly influential in the development of a methodology of sexology. This methodological approach was highly heteropatriarchal, privileging sex for procreation, preferably within the bounds of marriage, above all else, and pathologizing identities, desires, and practices that deviated from that goal. Perhaps the most famous of this generation of sexologists are Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who published Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886, and Havelock Ellis, who published 6 volumes of his studies in psychology of sex between 1897 and 1910. As forensic psychiatrists, most of the prominent figures in this field and thus use case studies and clinical observations, developing these observations into theories and concepts. This was the method, of course, employed by the more widely known Sigmund Freud. Freud in particular has remained influential in the field of sexuality studies, despite critiques of his approach and method. This was especially apparent in relation to his theories on women and girls in the form of female sexuality, where his highly patriarchal and personalized viewpoint comes to the fore in influencing his findings. Nonetheless, Freud's theories on sexuality are still widely used by academics, both within and without the psychological and psychoanalytical schools of thought, even in relation to queer theory. The likes of Freud and Krafft-Ebing were part of a sexological movement which was predominantly centered around Western Europe, but successive world wars forced many theorists to seek safety in the United States. This represented the beginning of a shift towards the American tradition of sexology. Whilst the tradition of psychoanalysis persisted, indeed thrived in the United States, many researchers were identifying that the majority of theory relating to sex and sexuality was derived from case studies of individuals deemed abnormal, deviant, or pathological by society and contemporary social mores. One such researcher was Catherine Bement Davis, who in 1929 published The Factors of the Sex Life of 2,200 Women. In a significant departure from the methodological practice and method of the psychologists and psychoanalysts, Bement Davis delivered an 8-page survey to thousands of women covering topics such as sexual experience in childhood, adolescence and adulthood, marital relations, masturbation, levels of desire and homosexuality. This new quantitative approach was perhaps most famously used by Alfred Kinsey and his team at the North American Institute for Sex Research. As Gagnon and Parker identified, the sex survey quickly became the paradigmatic research method with an emphasis on the autonomous survey respondent. Each respondent was given, in the democratic tradition, equal weight in determining the representations of sexual life in society. Unlike Vermont Davis, who used postal surveys, Kinsey's research team made use of the long-form interview with highly trained interviewers to try and ensure consistency. The interviews were survey-like in that they involved between 300 and 500 questions, the responses to which were recorded on punch cards to facilitate statistical analysis of the data. In total, Kinsey and his team interviewed in excess of 11,000 Americans, resulting in the publication of Sexual Behavior of the Human Male in 1948 and Sexual Behavior of the Human Female in 1953. In the following decades, William Masters and Virginia Johnson published Human Sexual Response in 1966 and Human Sexual Inadequacy in 1970. Masters and Johnson embraced the scientific approach further, not only in working to establish statistically relevant data, but by bringing sexology into the science lab. The couples observed nearly 700 people either having sex, that is to say, heteronormative penile vaginal penetrative intercourse, or masturbating. This might have been manually or with a device. In total, Masters and Johnson observed nearly 10,000 sexual acts whilst measuring participants' heart rate, breathing, and lubrication. This led to their development of the 4-stage sexual response cycle, that is excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. The rise of second wave feminism, alongside other movements for social change, which held links with academia, such as lesbian and gay studies, focused attention on the ways in which society constructs identities, realities, and truths. This called into question many broadly accepted truths. Among them was the concept that sexuality was wholly defined by its roots in biology and nature. Rather, there was a growing recognition that, like gender, sexuality was not simply human nature, but the consequence of culturally specific socialization. The conceptualization in turn began to refocus research attention on the symbolic dimensions of sexual experience and onto the intersubjective cultural forms that shape and structure the experience of sexual life in different social settings. These symbolic dimensions were finding a home within established sociological traditions of symbolic interactionism, spearheaded in the 1930s by George Herbert Mead, and applied directly to sexuality by Gagnon and Simon in 1973 in the formation of their sexual scripts theory. This understanding of sexuality as a socially constructed and enacted demanded a methodological shift towards a focus, or at least appreciation, of the role of culture, society, and identity. Social constructionist, interactionist sex research thus shifted away from examinations of the act or acts of sex itself to the systems and structures that defined and informed sex. As feminists chanted the personal as political, sex research had to adapt in recognition of its inherently political and politicized nature. In particular, sex research had to start to account for the presence and role of power in the sexualized being and in sexual interactions. The methodological shift here was profound and epistemological, in that it altered the questions of what should be studied in order to understand sex and sexuality. The fallacy of the unbiased, detached researcher was also exposed, giving way for a more open consideration of the role of the researcher played in epistemological, ontological, methodological, and analytical directions of their specific corner of sex and sexuality research. This included accounting for the identity of the researcher and in considering their biases and privileges, as well as their position of power relative to research participants. The direction that political and academic movements such as feminism and queer theory has taken sex and sexuality research, alongside the framework, or at least the tenets of symbolic interactionism, has led us to the point of what I will refer to as critical sexuality studies. As Barrett points out, critical approaches also concern themselves with action. They have an emancipatory interest, concerning themselves with injustice and the liberation of people from habit, custom, illusion, and coercion. This is a recognition both of the responsibility of the researcher to see and acknowledge oppression and inequality, and to challenge it through their research and its dissemination. This is expressed not only in broadly epistemological terms, but also in the detail of method. Tiefer asserts that in order to really understand the complex social and bodily entity that is sex and sexuality, researchers and scholars must respect, indeed embrace, a diversity of methods, recognizing that they are complementary and not competing. Tiefer calls on researchers to consider creative, experimental and participatory methods alongside the traditional methods that have been employed through sexological history, such as case studies and large-scale quantitative methods. Participatory methods are particularly critical in addressing the power imbalance in the research process. Both Carter and Barrett identify the key role that narrative methods play in emancipatory and participatory sex research. Narrative is the way in which participants communicate their experience of their own reality, incorporating how they see themselves, as well as the version of themselves they wish to project to others. This reflects the participant experience as defined by them, rather than on the terms bounded by the parameters of the researcher. Participation and narrative is central to the political goals of critical sexuality studies. Through delivering a participant-defined account of sexual existence, it aids in the development of sexual rights. This gives us a sense of the shape and approach of critical sexuality studies, rooted in interactionist traditions and nurtured by political and academic movements concerned with emancipation and egalitarianism. With such a perspective, it is, as I have noted, something of an omission that there has been little or no positive consent research driven by a critical sexuality studies methodological paradigm. I plan to address this with my current research. So my methodological approach begins with symbolic interactionism. The grounding of symbolic interactionism is that human beings are constantly creating and using symbolic means, and that these meanings not only help them to understand the world around them, but actually constitute it. Bloomer emphasizes that symbolic interactionists, in honoring this perspective, must study the empirical social world. He argues that the only way this can be done is to get close to that empirical social world, and importantly, to respect its nature. The symbolic interactionist does not seek objective distance, which fixes research topics and participants as other, nor do they attempt to make a social phenomena fit a method unnatural to the social world in which it functions and acts. The starting point here is for the researcher to question and open up their own preformed categories or assumptions about the meanings and significance of a topic at hand. The method of this research must then create as much space as possible for participants to define consent's meaning and practices for themselves. The participants themselves must also not just represent those most likely to be adhering to dominant discourses, but also those whose sexual voices are often silenced by society and academia. Bloomer defined research in part as exploration. He argued that exploration is by definition a flexible procedure, and consequently research approaches must be flexible and reflexive. This allows research to investigate a topic wherever it may go, rather than placing boundaries upon it, which may ultimately limit the understanding of the nature and scope of an experience for a diversity of people. Rather than just setting contrived checkpoints for researcher reflection, this research also places much of the flexibility and reflexivity in the hands of the participants. This seeks to respect the nature of the empirical world by limiting the imposition of boundaries on what participants may share. Respecting the nature of the empirical social world also extends to research practices and environments. Kogler points out that the ontological grounding of the uniqueness of human understanding in a shared human nature is paired with a clear awareness that this ground implies and requires a methodological reflection on the mode of access towards human action and expression. This indicates that access should not take place in an unnatural environment, such as a laboratory, and that an ideal research method would not require participants to engage in sharing their experience in a format that is unnatural to the phenomena being researched. This clearly indicates that a qualitative approach is required, as people do not make meaning and interact quantitatively. As sexual consent is an interaction with an intimate partner or partners, it stands to reason that the ideal research method would be an interaction between intimate partners. It's for this reason and others that the method of my research will be a conversation between sexual partners. This will present an opportunity for what Bloom discussed as the moving process of social life, in which participants are defining and interpreting each other's acts. A conversation between intimate partners, particularly about consent, will reflect the ways in which those partners interpret and respond to each other, while simultaneously allowing participants to consciously explore what idiosyncratic meanings they have developed for consenting, what aspects and definitions of consent are meaningful to them. Participants in sharing the story of how sexual communication came to be meaningful for them will be sharing a narrative of their own sexual story. The sexual story was a research method most recently popularized by Ken Plummer in 1994. He argued that the sexual story was and continues to be an important force in developing the sexual rights of all people. In highlighting the centrality of stories in civilization, Plummer drew on Geertz's conception of culture, pointing out that it is an ensemble of stories we tell about ourselves. What we explore when we look at people's sexual interactions might reasonably be called a representation of their sexual cultures, made up of the complexities that all culture is formed of, but practiced partially privately. Plummer is keen to point out that while sexual stories are a narration of that which is socially constituted, they also very much relations of the concrete bodily, emotional, and psychological experiences of individuals. Through these stories of these experiences, Carter points out that people relate not only to a description of events, but are also communicating how they see themselves and how they wish to be seen by others. Thus, when a person narrates a story, they hone and adapt it for their perceived audience. In making that audience the researcher, we move the story away from its original nature, because the image a person wishes to project of themselves to a researcher may differ substantially from that which they wish to project to their sexual partners. I propose making focus of the narrative delivered to and shared with the sexual partner so that it most closely reflects the empirical social world in which the events being narrated took place. Unlike what I propose here, Plummer's 1994 sexual stories were solo narrative, but his symbolic interactionist background came to the fore when he later, in 2013, acknowledged that we cannot have monologue alone, but that we must have dialogue, even in the stories we tell. This recognizes that all experiences are an interaction, even if that interaction is with ourselves, and that when we relate an experience in dialogue, we can more thoroughly and closely explore the empirical social world. Sexual stories in dialogue have the potential to capture how we understand our sexual selves, the sexual selves of each other, and the wider concept of the sexual and society. The method I propose here is dyadic, aimed at capturing the shared experience and shared meanings of sexually intimate people. Since consent is in every sense an interaction, usually dyadic, but sometimes group-based, the narrative is infinitely benefited by more directly representing that interaction. Gabingdon, Cheneville, and Rote point out that the advantage of dyadic research is that it allows insights into the within and between aspects of the shared experience, as well as exposing the interconnectedness and individual experiences in the same event. This is an element that has been missing from both consent research and wider sexual storytelling that this research will seek to address. So to detail clearly, the method I'm proposing is to record a diverse range of people conversing with their sexual partners about how consent works for them. This places the emphasis on defining and delineating consent with the participants and not the researcher, and empowers them through the process of shared narrative. It minimizes the researcher-participant power dynamic and locates the research participation in both a physical and symbolic space that is representative of the phenomena being studied. In this, it represents an interactionist critical sexuality studies framed exploration of positive sexual consent, so missing from the field. Thus, the major element of my research, which is innovative, is to focus on dialogue rather than monologue, which is unique in the field. I also embrace an interactionist-inspired critical sexuality studies approach, which seeks to empower through praxis as well as product. And just on screen there are the details of my project, which is called the Consent is Positive Project, and there's a web